So first of all, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this event run by the South Wales branch of the Royal Society of Biology. So our event is entitled Substance Abuse, Life and Death Perspectives. And as chair of the South Wales branch committee, it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for tonight. So our first speaker is Dr. Walter Tasosa. He is a senior mental health nurse and a lecturer in mental health nursing practice at the University of South Wales. And he is going to start off our event by talking about his research into the ethnographic aspects of alcoholism. And then following him, we have Dr. Steven Ledbetter, who is a renowned Cardiff University senior lecturer and forensic pathologist. He also covers the forensic pathology for a number of local police forces, including South Wales Police, Gwent Police, Dyfed Powys Police, and Gloucestershire Police. And he is going to be talking to us about investigating causes of death due to substance abuse. So I'd like to welcome everyone to please put any questions that you might have for either of our two speakers into the Zoom Q&A. And after Dr. Ledbetter has spoken, either myself or one of my colleagues on the committee will present your questions to the speakers, and hopefully we can have some discussion after those two talks. So I hope you enjoy tonight's event. Please do feel free to ask any questions through the Zoom Q&A. And now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Walter Tasosa.
Thank you, Henrietta. Thank you. I shall share the slides that I've got for now, so just bear with me. Right, yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. Yes, my name is Dr. Walter Tasosa. Just to introduce myself, I'm a lecturer in mental health based at the University of South Wales. Just to give a bit of my background, I started my career in the bench sciences. My first degree is actually biological sciences with specialty in parasitology and microbiology. So for about 10 years, I worked in the brewing sciences with a focus on research and development. But just over 20 years ago, I completely changed my career pathway and went into mental health nursing. I studied my mental health nursing from the University of Sheffield, and have practiced in a variety of settings across the UK with a focus on addictions. My special interests are, in alcohol research with a particular focus on health inequalities and migrant communities that are in the UK. So just to get on with my presentation, there's not much time that we've got. This study that I'm presenting today is actually informed by my PhD thesis, which was completed way back in 2018, in this entitled Ethnoepidemiology of Alcohol Use Among Zimbabwean Migrants Living in the UK. The aims of this study, which is informed by my thesis, is simply an exploration of the attitudes and perceptions regarding alcohol use among Zimbabwean migrants living in the UK. It also aims to investigate the factors associated with increased alcohol use among Zimbabwean migrants living in the UK. So the background really is in terms of finding ways to reducing alcohol harm amongst these marginalized populations in the UK. But for us to do that, we need to understand the attitudes and belief systems about alcohol, as well as the factors that are associated with increased drinking, etc. So from a harm reduction perspective, we cannot do that in terms of initiating policy without initially understanding those attitudes and belief systems that actually fuel alcohol use within these marginalized communities. And of course, understanding also the factors associated with increased drinking. Why study alcohol in the first place? someone might want to ask. Just from looking at the statistics there, the total cost to society is an estimated 21 billion pounds in the UK. And from a medical perspective, in terms of the impact it has on the NHS, we are spending 3.5 billion pounds every year. And this is related to just alcohol-related harm. So alcohol is an area in public health becomes a real issue, considering the economic costs that are associated with it. And just a bit of statistics from Alcohol Change UK, which is the biggest charity organization that deals with the alcohol harm. An estimated alcohol use is estimated to be the biggest risk factor for death, ill health, and disability among the 15 to 49-year-olds in the UK, and the fifth biggest risk factor of disability across the UK. And just looking at a bit more statistics there, in terms of comparing alcohol to other drugs that have an effect on the population health, we see that the total score for alcohol alone is 72 compared to cannabis at 20. So this again, tells us, the importance of understanding alcohol harm in the general population, but this study really tries to focus on those marginalized communities where the harm itself may be even worse. And therefore, in terms of informing health promotion initiatives that are evidence-based, we need to understand, these marginalized populations, particularly so the Black and minority ethnic populations in the UK. So again, why study alcohol? From a morbidity perspective, we've got to understand it. It causes a lot of disorders, psychiatric disorders. Depression is one of them. And when alcohol does interlink with depression, the morbidity, what happens to the person who is affected by both of these disorders is really distressing and causes a lot of harm to the person. But of course, physical health as well. We know that alcohol use causes a lot of physical health issues, ranging from hypertension to cardiovascular diseases, and of course, liver cirrhosis itself. So understanding alcohol and its use in specific populations does help us to start to think about appropriate interventions to reduce its harm. Again, looking just at a few stats here with the focus on Wales, the stats here from Alcohol Change UK again tell us that rates of alcohol-specific hospital admissions is 3.3 times higher in the most deprived areas of Wales. And we know that there's a specific link, there's a significant link between depravity, between and migrant communities and marginalized communities in the UK in general. And approximately 1,500 deaths are attributable to alcohol consumption each year, which accounts to about 1 in 20 of all deaths in the UK. So again, these figures simply, put it to us that alcohol is an issue that we have to think about from a harm reduction perspective. And 8% of the population drink over 14 units per week. This used to be 14 units per week used to be the standard which is considered a safe drinking. 14 units for females and 21 units for males. But now the latest health promotion messages are that no alcohol at all is safe in any form. And so really to be safe from any harm, you have to actually abstain from drinking alcohol. But one might also want to ask me why we have to study migraines. This just shows us the statistics in terms of migrants arriving into the UK. We know that now 45% of the total population change in the last 60 years in the UK is due to migration, which is why it is important that we understand what exactly is happening in these deprived, marginalized communities, for us to start to think about alcohol policies that are evidence-based and that relate well to the diversity that is now prevalent in the UK. So the methodology itself was mixed methods. It involved a focused ethnography and a survey. So that's just a graphical presentation of the methodology that I used to get the data and then to analyze the data. So you can see here we've got a qualitative and a quantitative strand. The qualitative strand itself was the ethnography, whereas the quantitative strand itself was the survey. So these two forms of data were then mixed and triangulated to produce the results that I'm going to present to you in the next couple of minutes. So the focus ethnography took 6 months. It was a multi-sited ethnography involving interviews and participant observations. A lot of ethical challenges were faced, as you can imagine. For example, how do you deal with someone who may be inebriated? And for example, how was I to make sure that I was safe in environments that can be considered as potentially resulting in aggression and the like. So a lot of ethical challenges there were put into consideration before the ethnography was put into place. This is just one of the photographs, of course, with the consent from the participants there, of the sort of places I was going into to gather information in terms of perceptions and attitudes related to alcohol use within this migrant population, but with the aim of trying to perhaps extrapolate that information and generalize what may be happening in other migrant communities in the UK. The strand 2, the quantitative aspect of it, involved a survey, and we had 543 participants, of which 11 were from Wales. The survey itself was designed using the results that I got from the ethnography. And from the survey itself, the results were grouped into 6 domains: alcohol-related behavior, social capital integration, and more importantly, the importance of health status in influencing levels of alcohol use within this migrant community. The Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, a World Health Organization tool, was actually used to measure outcome of alcohol use within the sample population here. And just going to the results now, the overarching themes that resulted from the ethnography itself, from the 6-month focused multi-sited ethnography, was the importance of gender expectancies and hegemonic masculinity in influencing alcohol use. Then there was also an element of cultural identity and cultural preservation. You'll find that most of the participants were continuing with the behaviors that they either had started or had seen their parents doing prior to immigration, then continuing with these behaviors after. But more importantly, from perhaps a biological medical perspective was the issue of stress management, coping, and social cohesions. So from most of the participants' lived experiences, their use of alcohol was simply to cope with the experiences linked to the, to migration, settling in a country a lot of them perceived as perhaps difficult to integrate in. So just looking at stress management here, the key issues that were coming out of here were experiences with UK immigration officials as a key stressor, using alcohol as a self-medication for loneliness, discrimination, racism, and prejudice, as either perceptions of participants, and coping with death of loved ones, experience of migrants not being able to visit Zimbabwe because of their immigration status, and using alcohol to cope with the stresses accompanying the migrant experience. So these are a few of the quotes that came from the sites that were used for the, for gathering information. That's one from site one, and the person cited the Home Office and the police as one of the stressors that were linking them to drinking in excessive means. Another quote there that you might want to look in your own spare time. And another quote there, which focuses on, the use, loneliness, and the fact that because the person is so lonely and they haven't got much more to do with their money, they would rather go and spend it with others in order to cope with the experiences that are linked to migration. So the results themselves, 65% were classified as really low risk in terms of the harm alcohol, in terms of the harm that alcohol could cause to them, but 6.5% of the that population, that sample population, were classified as possible dependents, and that's quite a high figure when you look at the UK average or mean, which is around 1.75%. But of course, this was not a representative population because of the methods that we used to sample to have the participants. So there may be some biases related to the sampling that was used compared to the one that was used that got the average of 1.74% across the UK. And these are just some of the results that came out in terms of what influenced what. And we find that those with excellent, those with the poorest health status, those participants who said that their health was really poor in the survey, were nearly 4 times more, nearly used alcohol 4 times more than those with excellent health. And we also find that females, the way that females used alcohol was significantly less compared to their male counterparts. We also find marital status playing a role here in influencing the use of alcohol here to cope with, the migrant experience, with those that were widowed, divorced, or separated, using a lot less alcohol there compared to those that were single. So contributions to knowledge itself. This study helps us to understand the diaspora population more, and it also helps us to understand methodologies regarding how best we can measure alcohol abuse. And it also helps us to understand the cultural and biological influences on drinking that we need to understand for us to develop, policies that are, that can be applied to reflect the diversity that's prevalent in the UK. But also important was that gender and drinking behavior, which can then also influence health promotion initiatives, which have to look at ways of dealing with the alcohol in the male population of this migrant population that we looked at. And from a recommendations perspective, all I can say is let's try and understand alcohol use by race and ethnicity, because we then can understand what exactly might be happening in other marginalized populations in the UK, for us to devise policies that are more effective to deal with the harm that alcohol causes. And lastly, let's also consider screening and brief interventions for targeted populations as the first point of call to reduce the impact that harm has on marginalized Black and ethnic minorities living in the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. So yeah, can I just encourage people to please put any questions for Walter into the Q&A, and then we'll come back to do look at the questions at the end of tonight's session. So now I'd like to hand over to our second speaker, Dr. Steven Ledbetter.
Well, thank you very much. As you've heard, I'm Steven Ledbetter. I'm Senior Lecturer in Forensic Pathology at Cardiff University. It's very kind of you to refer to me as being renowned, but I'm not sure that I deserve that adjective. And it may be that you'll agree that I don't deserve it. That's the end of this talk. What I'm going to talk about is the problems that a pathologist may face in investigating a death which may or may not be associated with substance abuse. And perhaps to carry on from the previous speaker, I may emphasize alcohol, but much of what I say will perhaps be equally applicable to other recreational substances that are abused. So the first point that one should make is that it is perhaps easy for an investigating authority to regard deaths in those who misuse substances as to be expected deaths, and for there then to be, as it were, a cognitive bias towards regarding such deaths as obviously arising from the misuse of that substance. I think that that is not a view that one would seek to promote. It may be that the death arises from that misuse, but one should never lose sight of the fact that those who misuse substances should be regarded as vulnerable, so that their circumstances through substance misuse or circumstances which lead to the substance misuse may lay them open, make them more vulnerable to death. And a simple example of such might be that someone who has taken alcohol and is regarded as intoxicated, their behavior may render them more susceptible or more at risk of violence. And that risk may arise from a greater propensity to enter into circumstances where violence may result. But it may also be that the failure of reaction times through intoxication may render a person more susceptible to the consequences of a violent act. An example might be that if you are struck or punched, if you are expecting a punch to land because you are sober and in a defensive position and tensing your musculature, then your head, if that is where the punch impacts, may not be subject to the movements that the unprotected, unguarded head might suffer, where the impact is to an head that is not tensed and therefore more free to move upon the neck. And it may be that where a head is taken backwards from a punch, that may result in injury as a consequence of that movement to an intracranial vessel. One might regard a death in such circumstances from what might be a traumatic basal subarachnoid hemorrhage bleeding below the middle covering around the brain stem as a consequence of injury to the vertebro-basilar arterial system, the posterior arterial supply to the brain. It may be that that death, usually following a cardiac arrest from the action of blood around the brain stem, may be regarded as an indirect death from misuse of, in that circumstances, alcohol. One might say also that if alcohol or another illicit substance is taken to combat mental health issues, particularly depression, anything that might increase a risk of self-harm is an indirect consequence of substance misuse. So one might look at deaths from substance misuse as either indirect deaths or direct deaths, where the death occurs not from an increased risk of exposure to violence or self-harm, but actually from some complication of that misused substance itself. And if one thinks about such direct association or causation between the substance and the death, the two major subdivisions of those may be considered to be poisoning, where one attributes the death purely to the substance itself, or to a pathophysiological complication which arises from that misused substance. If one thinks then about how may a misused substance lead to a fatal pathophysiological complication, then such a complication may be either anatomical, that is, the misuse of a substance leads to a structural change that can be seen at autopsy with the naked eye, or it leads to a change in function which may not be visible to the naked eye or even visible under the microscope when a person has died from that functional complication. So if I start in the first instance with giving some examples of an anatomical or macroscopically or microscopically visible complication arising from substance misuse, then one might think of an infective complication consequent upon intravenous drug misuse, where one is introducing needles into a vein. Then if one is not using a clean needle system, then you may introduce infection. That infection may cause endocarditis, infective inflammation, or possibly not even infective, but simple inflammation of the right-sided valves in the heart, the tricuspid or pulmonary valves. If that is an infective complication, then you may develop localized infection within the heart that may lead to death. If you have misuse of a sympathomimetic drug taken by any means, be it smoking, as in crack cocaine, or injection, or by mouth, then the elevation in blood pressure that you may see from its sympathomimetic action may lead to an intracranial hemorrhage. That is a direct anatomical complication of such sympathomimetic drug misuse. If one takes alcohol, then if one develops from that misuse of alcohol cirrhosis of the liver, the consequences of alcoholic cirrhosis may be one of obstruction to the portal vein, leading to portal hypertension and the development of abnormal dilatation of veins which drain into the portal vein, giving you what are termed classically esophageal varices, varices within the gullet, which may rupture and cause catastrophic hemorrhage. That is a direct anatomical complication of alcohol misuse which may lead to death. If one sticks with alcohol, then those who misuse alcohol persistently, what one may sometimes regard somewhat dismissively as chronic alcoholics, the functional complications, particularly where there is cirrhosis, may be an increased propensity for that alcohol misuser to suffer disturbance of function of the heart, which may make the person more prone to a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. That was first described where clinicians recognize that those with established cirrhosis have changes in the QT interval in the electrocardiogram, which may make the individual more susceptible to a torsade de pointe arrhythmia, which may lead to ventricular fibrillation and sudden death. And such an arrhythmogenic potential is recognized now not only with those who have alcoholic cirrhosis, but those who may have alcohol-related fatty change within the heart before that has progressed to cirrhosis. And the difficulty for the pathologist who makes a post-mortem examination in such circumstances is that you may see nothing other than fatty change within the liver or cirrhosis within the liver. That fatty change and that cirrhosis will be no different to the naked eye or under the microscope to what that individual had lived with for however long it had taken for those changes to occur. But while one can hypothesize from one's knowledge of clinical associations that an arrhythmia may have occurred, one is unable, with the naked eye or under the microscope, to say that that is what in fact had occurred. And that is an example of how, if one thinks about the findings or the range of findings that one might have at post-mortem examination, those findings may be you have a demonstration of a condition which is incompatible with life. That's round about 10 to 15% of post-mortem examinations. You may have a post-mortem examination which fails to find anything, however carefully that examination is made. Perhaps another 5 to 10% of post-mortem examinations. And that leaves you with a residuum of, shall we say, 75 to 80% of cases where all that one finds is a condition with which that person may have lived for some time, and pragmatically one takes the view, if there is a credible pathophysiological link, such as an increased propensity to arrhythmia, one says that that is now the condition from which that person has died. That perhaps leaves me then with what you might think one would talk about when faced with deaths from substance misuse, which is, how do pathologists say this person has died from a fatal level or concentration within the blood of a certain substance? And the difficulty that one faces is that determining what may be regarded as a concentration in blood at which death must ensue is enormously difficult, because much may turn upon the habituation of the user or misuser of the substance to that substance itself. if one takes alcohol as an example, as you will know, the upper limit in blood for an offence under the Road Traffic Acts is 80 milligrams per 100 millilitres of blood. If one is not accustomed to taking alcohol, it has been said that a concentration in blood at post-mortem examination above 250 milligrams per 100 millilitres may be regarded as a fatal concentration. However, those who are habituated to alcohol may show no difference in their normal functioning state with a concentration in blood of 450 milligrams per 100 millilitres. And there are cases within the literature where random stopping of individuals who are driving have yielded concentrations in blood of over 1,000 milligrams per 100 mil. So one can see that a simple reliance on a number is not in itself a necessary explanation for death. The other difficulty with quantification of drugs in blood after death is whether that concentration in the blood taken after death necessarily accurately mirrors the concentration in blood at the time of death, because substances may redistribute themselves after death between various body compartments, or a substance itself may be altered after death through post-mortem change, particularly in the case of alcohol, the action of those organisms that may come to populate the body after death. And again, one might have to say, well, I have this figure. Here, for example, is someone who has taken, shall we say, methylene dioxymethamphetamine, a drug which is misused by many, not all of whom die. So why is it that this person who has taken methylene dioxymethamphetamine has died in a temporal relationship to taking that drug? Could it be that that drug has brought about the death not through a direct quantitative poisoning effect, but because there is an individual susceptibility in that dead person to that drug itself? Again, is this a person who has an unrecognized genetic susceptibility to cardiac arrhythmia, which has been unmasked or triggered by taking that drug, which again may have a sympathomimetic action upon the heart, which renders that heart more susceptible to the development of an arrhythmia. So my final point would be that one should not regard those who misuse substances as necessarily dying from that substance itself alone, and one should never dismiss the deaths of those who misuse substances as something to be expected and therefore not subject to the same investigative rigor that those who do not misuse substances will be subject to. One should not say, as the vulgar parlance might be, this man's just a misuser of alcohol, the death is no surprise. It requires to be investigated with the same care as any other sudden death in the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. There we go. Okay, so we've already had one question submitted in the Zoom Q&A, and obviously please feel free to submit any further questions. So our first question comes from Annette, and I think this is primarily to Walter, although obviously both of you feel free to chip in. She's asking, so regarding the high levels of alcohol use seen in deprived areas, are all of these deprived areas in cities or urban areas, or are any of them in rural communities? Oh, you're muted. There we go.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Yeah. Based on the study that I conducted, unfortunately, for us to understand where deprivation and alcohol, the link between deprivation and alcohol use, we've got to understand and use postcode indices to, in order to identify where people are living. But unfortunately, because most of the participants were not willing to provide their postcodes for the simple reason that alcohol use is a very stigmatized area, and therefore also because we were using, the population here was largely migrant communities, they were very reluctant to get to others to understand where they were living. So I would have wanted to identify deprivation levels using post indices and then relate that to the levels of alcohol use. However, having said that, the evidence is still from the scoping review tells us that there's more deprivation is more within cities compared to rural areas, simply because in the UK, most parts of the rural areas are farming areas, and we just generally get migrants that just come in for harvesting and the like, and they move out. But yeah, so I would say most of the deprivation will be within the larger cities. And as we found also, say, from the research that is being done with COVID, for example, we linked deprivation to COVID and the larger cities where most of those that live within those deprived areas are, more reluctant to engage in health-seeking behaviors. So I hope I've answered your question there.
I think I have a question sort of on a similar line to that, which is, so I was interested in your point about the link between alcohol dependence and health. It seemed like poor health seemed to lead to alcohol dependence, and alcohol dependence led to poor health.
Yes.
Vicious circle. So how can we sort of break this cycle potentially? Where's the best way to address this?
Yes, very interesting. Yes, a significant link there between those that had poorer health outcomes with alcohol, alcohol use that is harmful to them. I think because the link here comes from the point of view of the fact that those with poorer health outcomes are probably already alcohol dependent, and therefore they then continue to use that alcohol, and alcohol use is quite high in those, in that population group. And to break that cycle, I think we actually have to start from the point of view of engaging in interventions and screening in the lower risk population to stop them from, reaching that point whereby it may actually be too late to engage in terms of screening and interventions. But yes, it's an unfortunate vicious circle there where we find that those who had poorer health outcomes, and most of them because of alcohol itself anyway, would be drinking a lot more compared to those that had, better health outcomes. Thanks, Henrietta. Yeah.
And I think this possibly might be a question for both of you potentially, which is some of the damage caused either by alcohol or these other substances, is it reversible? Or once the damage has been done, is it essentially irreversible in that person?
I can come in here and perhaps say that some things are reversible. Cirrhosis is probably not reversible, but of course the difficulty one has is identifying where in the progression of a disease a person is when they present, which I think goes back to the previous question in a way, and the previous answer, which is that all that one can do in terms of reversibility is identify those who may go on to develop the irreversible at an early enough stage to prevent them making that progress. The other difficulty that one faces, of course, is that you cannot predict who will develop irreversible cirrhosis from misuse of alcohol, because not everyone who misuses alcohol will necessarily develop cirrhosis.
Yeah, thank you. And just to add on that as well, because this study didn't just look at things from the point of view of, the medical model here, it looked at the psychosocial issues that impact on behaviors related to alcohol use. One of the ways forward as well is to actually change the attitudes and understanding of the populations in terms of what they perceive as harm, as alcohol harm. What came out from my ethnography was that participants were telling me that it does not matter how much you actually drink. What matters is whether you continue to do what is expected of you by your communities, like going to work, looking after your family. So one participant, I remembered, said, I could drink 14 pints a day, but as long as I am looking after my family and they are happy and I look well, there's no point in me getting worried about that. So the idea is also to actually change that attitude, to start to make people to understand that even though things may be okay in that regard, but the harm that alcohol is causing is going to be there maybe 20 years from the time that they're actually consuming alcohol, that pint. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think Stephen Walden, so a colleague of mine on the RSB committee, have a question.
I have one question each for both gentlemen. First one for Dr. Leadbeatter. Have you come across any cases of pontine rent that were due to alcohol-induced violence? And was the perpetrator, the victim, or both intoxicated?
Well, I don't know that I've necessarily come across an individual case of pontine rent. That is usually, shall we say, perhaps a movement of the head with greater velocity or acceleration than might be possible from a single punch. Whether one sees a pontine rent in a head-on traffic incident, which has occurred under the influence of alcohol, I don't know that I have personal experience of that or personal observation of such, but one can see how that possible chain of causation at least arises theoretically, in that you have pontine rent, high velocity deceleration, an incident in which a misuse of substance occurs. But again, while I might see the anatomical change, I wouldn't necessarily be able to say that it was the substance misuse or level which had actually set up that direct chain of causation.
Thank you. And my second question is for Dr. Tasosa. Where have you come across possibly the interplay between collective coping strategy and peer pressure? Where does one stop and where does another begin?
Right. The interface between collective coping strategies and peer pressure, I think, if I got you right.
Yes.
Yes, there's definitely a link there between collective coping strategies and peer pressure. But where we can divide the line there, it's really difficult because those two are very much interconnected. Based on the ethnography that I carried out, there was collective coping there from the point of view of the communities gathering in social places for drinking purposes as part of the coping, as part of their coping mechanism, but also in the process there would be a lot of peer pressure, perhaps to drink more, and that comes from that element of masculinity where the participants that I interviewed may find it difficult to actually leave the place to go home because of that peer pressure amongst participants that would be informing the other to continue drinking in order to feel that you are a man among other men. Yeah, so interesting, but it will be really difficult to divide that. Yeah, but definitely interlinked.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have a question from Rachel. She's asking, is there a known genetic or familial link for alcohol misuse? So I think this might be, again, for Dr. Tassosa.
Yes, there is definitely a genetic link there, even though I think environmental factors actually play the bigger role here. We know that the evidence tells us that if people of Black origin, for example, drink the same amount of alcohol that harms the body compared to their Caucasian counterparts, there would be more harm in Black communities compared to their Caucasian counterparts. But it is not really known how the interplay between genetics and that, what actually causes that to happen. And we also find that in South Asian communities, for example, they are affected by alcohol a lot more compared to other populations, compared to other races. And there's actually an allele, a gene allele that is linked to that susceptibility to alcohol compared to other races. Yes, definitely there is a link there.
Well, thank you. And I think just one final question for Dr. Leadbeatter. You did sort of touch on this in what you were saying, but I was curious about, someone who presents having taken multiple drugs, maybe alcohol and other drugs as well. What sort of process do you go through to try to work out which is kind of the main cause of death?
Well, it's a process that sadly, one might say, turns entirely upon the idiosyncrasy of the pathologist, in that what one would hope had happened is that one has not just assumed that this is a drug-related death because the death occurs in someone who is known to misuse drugs. And what one would hope is that in that individual, you have not just confined your investigations to taking blood and getting drug levels. You will also have looked at every organ in the body, not only with the naked eye, but under the microscope, so that what you have then is an established absence of anatomical changes. That may then leave you with your only positive finding being the detection of these drugs. What one does then is determine whether those drugs are capable of acting in an additive way on a specific physiological mechanism. So let us say someone has multiple levels of depressant drugs in the blood, and none of those levels is necessarily within the range of concentrations that the literature would regard as fatal. But let us say that that person has changes within the lungs of Apache bronchopneumonia, not sufficient inflammation within the lungs to cause death itself, but a marker perhaps that the person has been unconscious for a period, subject to respiratory depression, sufficiently long for those changes to develop within the lungs, but also sufficiently long for the levels that you found at death to have been perhaps appreciably higher at an earlier point. Does that make sense? And then one makes the pragmatic decision that the death has arisen from the combination of those drugs. Whether one just says mixed drug toxicity, or whether one names each of those drugs and all of those drugs, or whether one names only those drugs that you feel are present at the highest concentration and therefore the most likely to have played a part, as I say, is a part of the idiosyncrasy or the art, if one wants to use a more pompous word, that the pathologist brings to the investigation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting insight into your professional work. So I'd just like to wrap up tonight's event by thanking our two speakers again. So thank you very much to Dr. Walter Tassosa and to Dr. Steven Leadbeatter. Thanks also to everyone who's attended and submitted those interesting questions. It's been a very interesting, a very thought-provoking couple of talks and discussion afterwards. So our next event is actually next Monday and is on quite a different topic. It's on the evolution of burial practices in early hominids. So I'll put a slide just to advertise that on in a moment. And on that note, so thank you again to both our speakers, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.